whether you're nestled into warm blankets, or reclining beneath the slow hum of a ceiling fan, whether the window is cracked just slightly and the world outside has gone dim, or the last flicker of lamplight spills across the page of a book you no longer intend to finish, you are here now, and there is nothing you must do. Nothing to prepare, nothing to decide. Just listen, just breathe. Let the tension fall from your shoulders. Let your eyes close fully, or just a little. Let your mind wander toward quiet places. Somewhere old, somewhere forgotten, somewhere adrift in time. Tonight, we drift into the waters of Georgian Britain, not across oceans, or toward conquest, but tethered, still, watching the tide. We float not on grand ships of war, but on vessels, once mighty, and now raw. These were not ships built for speed or glory, they were built for punishment, repurposed for silence, moored in harbors and estuaries, tethered to docks like enormous wooden coffins, slowly unraveling with the tide. This was Britain in the late 1700s, a nation of enlightenment and iron, of powdered wigs and chained ankles, of philosophical inquiry and human neglect, an age that spoke of liberty, reason, and civilization, and practiced them with conditions. It was a time of scientific salons, of candlelit experiments in polite company. It was also a time of open sewers, debtors imprisoned for decades, and laws that punished the poor for being born into the wrong streets. An age of progress and of bureaucracy, where punishment was measured not in brutality alone, but in duration, in sameness, in silence, in forgetting. The prison hulk was not a place where people were meant to die, but neither was it built for living. These ships tethered permanently in the mouths of rivers like the Thames or the Medway were skeletal warships, stripped of sails and hope, hollowed out to hold the surplus condemned. Men, women, boys too young to shave, the guilty, the petty, they were crammed into darkness, into hammocks and chains, into rules and routines that ground a self down to a daily clatter of footsteps and hunger. They were not sailors, not soldiers, not free, but they were there, and tonight, softly, without judgment, without urgency, we will join them. Not to suffer, not to save, but to see, to breathe, to listen for what lingers. We begin, gently, in the hold of a prison hull, in the damped gloom below the waterline, where the world smelled of sweat and seawater and wood swelling under pressure. We'll hear the muffled echoes of discipline, of footsteps pacing in circles, of hunger and habit, and of the smallest gestures of resistance. A joke whispered in the dark, a scrap of bread shared unseen. Then, we'll drift thousands of miles away to Botany Bay, and there we will meet Mary Bryant, a mother, a thief, an exile, a woman who stood before British justice and was sent away from everything she had ever known. But Mary did not disappear. She crossed oceans. She outlived expectations. She escaped. Her story is one of survival, physical, moral, maternal agency, world that called her disposable. We will follow her gently, across the sea, and then back again, to a country unsure how to receive a ghost. After that, we go north, far north, into snow that never melts, into the silence of ice, into the mystery of the Franklin expedition. 2 British ships, proud and prepared, vanished into the Arctic while seeking the fabled Northwest Passage. What followed were years of searching, of denial, of rumors. Bones were found. Stories emerged from Inuit witnesses. Traces of something unspeakable, and now letters, lead, and forensic whispers tell us more. But not everything. Some parts remain frozen. Finally, we return to the heart of polite society, to the Royal Society. There, gentlemen in wigs sat beside glass domes and decaying frogs, and discussed immortality between glasses of port. Science met spectacle. The natural world was questioned, dissected, displayed, sometimes for truth, sometimes for status, always for something more than what appeared on the surface. Each of these stories tonight is tethered to the same undercurrent: containment, whether in chains or cages, institutions or ice, whether in a prison cell or a scientific salon, whether literal or social, visible or hidden. A rhythm of punishment, a tide of forgetting, a thread of breath in a sealed room, but in each space, something endured, a voice, a memory, a detail too quiet to make history books, but too human to be lost entirely. You do not need to stay awake. There will be no test. The names, the dates, they will come and go like waves. Let them drift. Let them settle. Let your breath follow the quiet rhythm of a ship at anchor. Welcome to history's quieter rooms. You may rest here, Under the low beams of the prison hulk's belly, where the lanterns cast more shadow than light, and the air is thick with a quiet, sour fatigue, there is no single story, no one crime, no shared origin. The men who breathe together in this floating cell block, who itch the same lice, who cough into the same stale mist of human exhale, are bound not by similarity, but by their shared invisibility, by the simple fact that they have been deemed not worth remembering beyond the numbered records in some clerk's ledger. You cannot tell by smell or posture or the way they hold their tin bowls who among them stole bread to feed a starving sister, and who defied a magistrate or broke a soldier's nose in a tavern. Dispute that lasted less than a minute and changed everything. Here, guilt is not just measured by, did it? It's tangled with place of birth, with accent, with what shoes a man wore the day he was arrested. It is a system of law so layered it chokes itself. English common law, maritime codes, local borough statutes, the whims of petty judges and city constables, colonial overlays, the shifting policies of Parliament on penal reform. A man might be held not for what he did, but for where he did it, or who he angered, or how full the other jails were that month. Debt, for instance, was a crime without violence and without mercy. Fail to pay a sum, be it a sovereign or a shilling, and you might find yourself chained next to someone who cut a man's throat on a London bridge. There is no distinction in darkness. Debtors here are common, though they rarely speak. Theirs is a shame that folds inward, a silence that sets them apart, even as they suffer the same lice and mold. Then there are the pickpockets, some young enough to be mistaken for boys, but hardened in eye and gesture by the cold mathematics of survival. They learned to move fast, to disappear between coats and carts, but the law caught up, as it often does when the poor become too visible in the wrong neighborhood, and so they find themselves here, in limbo, neither punished enough to be executed, nor considered safe enough to be let go. There are the smugglers, too, whose crimes lie buried beneath casks and false walls. Men who once ferried goods across coastlines, now trapped in a cell that smelled of brine but offers no freedom. A few are soldiers' deserters from regiments they claim never fed them, punished for walking away from orders issued by men who never learned their names. Among the most silent are the transported prisoners not yet sent or returned from penal colonies like Botany Bay, where Britain emptied its shame onto foreign shores. Some were exiled years ago and brought back for infractions in far-off lands, now doubly lost. Too far from the colonies to belong, too stained to rejoin the homeland. Political prisoners are rare, but not absent. You hear their voices in precise language. Careful enunciation men who once wrote essays or agitated in pamphlets, now reduced to the same damp straw as the pickpocket who can not read his own sentence. Sometimes there is tension. Sometimes a man scowls at the educated accent of his bunk, resentful of the kind of guilt that comes with ink rather than blood. But mostly, they are all too tired to care. Then there are those with foreign names, accents muddied by time, men who may have worshipped differently or spoken too freely in the wrong marketplace. Religious difference becomes criminal when it offends the wrong sensibility, and so a Muslim sailor, a Jewish tinker, or an Irish Catholic with too much opinion might all find themselves lumped in among thieves and blasphemers, their only shared trait being the bad luck of their birth. Each hulk holds its own constellation of stories, crimes real and imagined, misdeeds punished or exaggerated, some fabricated entirely. Trials are not always held. Evidence can be a whisper, a suspicion, or the absence of a bribe. Guilt, here, is often a shape imposed, not a truth discovered. You might hear a man mutter, in the early hours of the morning, as rats scurry along the beam above, "They never proved it." But the ship does not care. The guards do not care. The sea, lapping gently against the hull, does not care. And you, lying in your hammock, do not ask. Because whatever he did not do, he is here now, like you. Breathing this air, living in this sameness, it is safer not to know, to let each man be the version of himself he becomes here, in the hold. A man defined not by his past, but by the way he scratches, the rhythm of his cough, the steadiness of his hands when the gruel is passed down. Outside this place, a man might be judged by his education, his profession, his coat, how he endures. Some guards believe they know the stories. They refer to prisoners by type: a biter, a mutterer, one of the quiet ones. These are not legal categories, but behavioral codes created by those who see the human tide roll past day. The god's power is not just physical, it is interpretive. A man might be beaten not for an action, but for a look, for standing too tall, for speaking too softly when asked his name. And still, among all this arbitrariness, the system continues. It feeds itself. Records are kept. Transfers are ordered. Sentences are extended or shortened without explanation. There is no fairness in the hull, only consistency. And that consistency dulls the edge of outrage until it becomes habit. Even the innocent, if such a word still holds meaning here, begin to lose their sharpness. They forget how to protest. They forget how to remember what they were before the chain was fitted. And so, they sit, eat, sleep, scratch, sigh, and count the sounds of the river. The ship does not ask why they came. It only asks that they stay. There is no sunrise in the hull, only the voice, a single voice, rasped and weary, but firm enough to summon another repetition of the same endless day. It is not shouted, not barked like on the parade grounds of a soldier's life. It is simply said, at the same hour the guard's body now knows better than any clock up. One word, just enough to stir the air, and it ripples through the hold like a cold breeze no one asked for. That is the morning call. Not a bell, not a shaft of golden light breaking across stone, not a clink of a teacup or a cock's cry, just that voice low, habitual, uninterested. You know the guard by his cough, dry and persistent, often rising before his footsteps. And then there is the creak one boot, always louder than the other, a groan of leather and sole that betrays his presence long before the flickering oil lamp behind him confirms it. He doesn't speak much, except for that one word. He doesn't need to. You know what's expected. You rise, not from rest, but from the collapse your body forced upon itself the night before. Sleep is not a sanctuary here. It is an intermission, a pause between discomforts. Your hammock, if you have one, swings gently in the stale air, the ropes worn thin, the canvas moist from the breath of too many men sleeping too close. It smells of mildew and old wool. If you have no hammock, it's the floor a patch of splintered wood, or damp straw, or nothing. The air is wet, but not fresh, heavy with shared exhale, sour with sweat, rank with the open breath of the river that seeps in through every seam. Every breath tastes like someone else's. Every inhale, a reminder that you are never alone, never free, never clean. You rise slowly, bones stiff, joints cracking, scratching at bites you no longer even register. You've learned to live with the crawl of lice across your skin. The itch has become familiar, almost reassuring in its constancy, like the coughs, like the clinks, like old Tom humming the same Irish lullaby he's hummed every morning for 6 months. No one knows if it's for a child, a woman, or himself. No one asks. You like it, in a way. It's a human sound. A thread of memory so thin, it might snap any moment, but for now, it holds. A moment later, there's the meal if today is a day with food, gruel, served lukewarm, sometimes gray, sometimes brown, sometimes with a layer of film on top. It comes in a wooden bowl if you're lucky, in rusted tin if you're not, and sometimes in nothing at all if the guards are irritated or supplies delayed. No one complains. Complaining leads to less, not more. You hold the bowl if you have one, or share, or wait your turn with a spoon made from a broken handle. The taste is neutral, dull, forgettable. The warmth is fleeting. It coats the inside of your mouth with blandness. But you eat every drop. You learn to love it for what it is, not flavor, not nutrition, but survival. You eat beside the same men, the same positions, the same murmured prayers. Then, a shuffle toward the single bucket, tucked in the darkest corner behind a hanging cloth no longer white. It is a problem, a stench, a presence. The bucket fills fast and is emptied rarely. Its smell mingles with the rest, a smell that never leaves. It clings to your skin, your clothes, the back of your throat. Even if you were to see sky again, you'd carry it out with you, like a shadow. After food and waste, the hours stretch, undefined. You might be assigned a task. Scrub the deck, clean a pail, pass coal. You might sit, you might stare, you might scratch your initials into the beam for the 100th time, watching the wood flake under your nail. Old Tom tells stories sometimes, slow and meandering, mostly how he's missing 2 teeth and 1 eye, but he remembers dates better than any man you know. August 3rd, he'll mutter, rained that day. Rats were faster than usual. He does not smile when he says it. It is not a joke. It is just a fact. Like everything else, the guards pass by, some silent, some cruel, some just tired. One of them creaked, but You call him a has taken to flicking water at prisoners to keep them awake. Not from malice, just boredom. Time needs something to do. You count not the days, but the coughs, the meals that tasted like nothing. At night, you lie back into the same place, fold yourself small, and listen to the slap of the river, to the whisper of the wind through cracks in the hole, to the breath of the man beside you, to old Tom's lullaby, again, barely audible, just enough to remind you that tomorrow, if it comes, will be the same. And that, somehow, unbelievably, that might be the best thing you can hope for. Because the rhythm, however grim, is steady. And steady is what keeps your mind from breaking in too. In the dim slant of light that barely filters through the cracks in the timbers where the smell of iron and rot lingers, even in silence you come to understand something. Quietly, without needing to be told, it isn't just the men who are layered and worn. It's the law itself. British justice, if it can be called that. Here is not a singular blade, but a braided rope of old customs, new policies, whispered fears, and unseen hands tightening at both ends. The laws that placed these men here were stitched together from 100 threads. Protestant moral codes, maritime regulations from admiralty courts, borough fines, invented to fund local debtors' jails. Ancient landholder privileges and colonial mandates scribbled by men in powdered wigs, who never once walked the streets they claimed to govern. The result is a net, not a scale, a snare, not a system, and those caught within it range from the obviously guilty to the merely unlucky, the defiant to the disposable. There are debt prisoners, men who once borrowed a shilling too many, or missed a payment on a cracked cartwheel, or signed a loan to buy winter coal and failed to pay the interest. They do not speak of their crimes because their crimes are embarrassing. There is no romance in poverty, no dignity in failure. They hold themselves differently, shoulders rounded, not from labor, but from shame. They are often older, their clothes patched in places, even the lice avoid, their eyes cast down even when speaking. A few still carry the ledgers that ruined them, folded scraps of paper with faded signatures that they keep, not as proof but as penance. Then there are the petty thieves' boys, sometimes not more than 12, who were caught lifting bread from a stall, or slipping an apple into a coat already stuffed with rags. Their hands are quick, but their silence is quicker. They know better than to explain. Some tried to feed siblings, others simply moved wrong, in a world where movement was already a risk. Women, too, though fewer in number, lie chained near the corners of the hold, separated by a thin plank or curtain if the ship bothers at all. Their crimes, often survival itself, lying on census forms, stealing cloth to wrap a newborn, wandering without employment. Some are marked as vagrants, though they were once wives or laundresses, now discarded by families unwilling to bear the cost of their needs. One woman, they say, once worked in a manor house where she taught herself to read. She forged a letter for her brother to help him escape conscription, and now counts the days on her sleeve with thread. There are war prisoners, too, although no wars were declared by them. Irish rebels caught in countryside raids, bound not by battlefield defeat, but by suspicion and accent. Colonial insurgents from far shores, Jamaican laborers accused of stirring unrest, or Indian sailors arrested for speaking back to an officer's order. Their chains are the same, but their stories are quieter, muffled by ignorance and geography. No one on the hulk understands the languages they sometimes whisper in sleep. Guards call them foreigners, though many were born under the same crown that now punishes them. And scattered among them all are the misjudged, the misfiled, the misplaced, the men who should not be here but are. Because a name was misspelled, because a magistrate wanted to make an example, because a witness did not arrive or was paid not to. Their crime is absence of proof, of status, of the right friends in the right places. Some insist on their innocence for the first few weeks. Then they go quiet, not because they are lying, but because they see the truth of the place. Guilt here is not always something you earn. It is something you wear, like a collar handed out at the gangplank, fitted tight enough to leave no room for questions. These men do not speak unless spoken to. Their crime, if it exists, is long blurred at the edges. They do not expect justice, only duration. They wait, because there is nothing else to do. If you listen carefully, in the in-between moments when the hold is still and the river laps gently outside, you will hear it in the cadence of breath and shuffling feet. This is not a place of criminals. It is a place of the processed, the sorted, the shelved, like old goods stored below deck, human cargo catalogued and forgotten. The guards refer to them by number or by nickname if they've grown fond or irritated. The preacher, names stripped of origin, reduced to role in routine. Once, a new guard asked why one man was chained so tightly to the wall. The answer came not from a record, but from another prisoner. He read too much. That was enough. And so, the stories drift not from courtrooms, but from bunk to bunk, from whisper to whisper. The truth doesn't matter much here. What matters is who remembers your name when it's read aloud. For transport, what matters is whether you've learned to disappear into routine, to count your bites rather than your blessings, to let your past dissolve into the wood grain of the whole. Because here, guilt is not a conclusion, it's a condition. And innocence is not a defense, it is a complication. You learn quickly not to ask why someone is here, not because you don't care, but because you know, in time, it might be you answering, and your answer will sound just as hollow as theirs. Discipline on the Hulk was not loud, not frenzied, not born of passion or outrage. It was procedural, deliberate, a form of choreography designed not only to correct but to instruct, not merely to hurt but to shape the silence. A punishment here did not arrive in the middle of the night or as a surprise. It came slowly, like everything else, announced not with ceremony but with the absence of movement, the quieting of breath, the sudden awareness that a new stillness had entered the space. You knew it was coming when the guard stood straighter, when a chain was unclipped with care, when a name not always the right one was spoken into the dark. The condemned man, whether guilty or merely chosen, did not resist. Resistance was a performance with no audience. Instead, he rose with the weariness of someone who has already rehearsed this in dreams, stepped forward in rhythm with the boots behind him, and allowed himself to be led up toward the open deck where the others were already being assembled, not by command, but by a sort of shared instinct. The punishments were public not by accident, but by design. A man punished in secret could be forgotten. A man punished before others became part of their memory, part of their quiet calculus about which risks were worth taking. So they gathered, barefoot, blinking into the daylight they rarely saw, squinting into the gray sky like men remembering how to hope but too tired to try. The punished was often made to walk just once slowly down the central deck, chains clinking softly, his shirt already stripped, his eyes already distant. It was not a procession meant to elevate the spirit, nor to cleanse it. It was a procession to mark time, to say, this is what waiting becomes when it moves. No man shouted. No man wept. That came later. The lash itself was not wild. It was delivered with method. The hand that swung it did not tremble. It was lifted, descended, lifted again. Each strike like punctuation in a sentence no one wrote but everyone had read. The sound was not the worst of it. It was the waiting before, the hush between, the quiet afterward. The skin broke sometimes, but always beneath the gaze of men trained to look and not see. Blood was not announced. The wound was not named. Only the moment was absorbed, soaked into the group, like damp into cloth, staining nothing visibly but felt for days. Afterward, the punished was left to return to his place. No acknowledgement. He sat or lay where he had lain the day before, except that now his breath came differently, shorter, shallower, and those near him would offer nothing not out of cruelty, but out of a shared understanding. To speak of it was to make it real, and they had all learned that some realities were better left unnamed. Beyond the lash, there were other tools not of pain, but of erosion. Meals withheld, hours of standing in place, names called and not answered. A man might be made to wait for a message that never came, or told he would be moved, then left where he was for weeks. Uncertainty was its own kind of discipline. It needed no rope, no hand, just time untimed the ship had in abundance. There were other punishments, smaller, more private. A ration removed for speaking out of turn. A new chain added for coughing at the wrong moment. A look from a guard that meant something had been noticed and would be remembered. The guards rarely raised their voices. They didn't need to. Authority did not live in volume. Lived in the way one paused at a door, or how long one's footstep echoed in the corridor. There were no rules posted, no laws read aloud, and yet everyone knew what was permitted and what was not. It changed often, but that was part of the lesson. To obey not a rule, but a mood, and beneath it all quieter than chains, lighter than breath was fear, not the kind that made men scream, but the kind that made them silent. Fear did not shout. It sat beside you. It ate with you. It slept beside you. It curled into your hammock at night and traced patterns in your dreams. It stood behind the guard with the uneven boots and whispered, "Say nothing." It watched as men averted their eyes from punishment, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. It reminded you not to grow too bold, not to laugh too loudly, not to speak of the time before, when your name still meant something beyond the ledger. Fear was the true warden. The guards changed shifts. The chains rusted. The rats died and were replaced. But fear remained constant, familiar, patient, intimate. It did not punish in fits. It punished in presence. And so, day after day, men adjusted, not to the pain, but to the anticipation of it, not to the system, but to its absence of logic. They learned how to move without offense, how to speak without content, how to become flat enough to escape notice. To avoid punishment was not to be good, it was to be forgettable, to become a shadow among shadows, and that, in the end, was the greatest control of all. Not the lash, not the chain, but the slow shaping of men into silence, into watchers, into participants in their own vanishing. Even in a place built on control and decay, where every board creaked beneath the weight of routine, and every hour moved like smoke, curling slowly through a broken pane, there were moments small and barely spoken, that threaded their way through the darkness like shafts of sun briefly slipping between clouds. They did not change the system, they did not lift the chains, but they reminded the men just faintly that they were still men, still capable of something beyond survival. These flickers of humanity did not arrive with they did not announce themselves. They came quietly, so as not to be broken by the stillness around them. A joke, for instance, passed from one man to another during the rations line, soft enough to be mistaken for a cough, but sharp enough to draw the faintest curl at the corner of a lip. The joke was old, perhaps meaningless to anyone outside the hull, but here it was, currency. Not a rebellion, not a protest, but a reclamation of tone, of timing, of the right to notice absurdity. Even the guard Creek boot, as they still called him, paused for a half-sec. His head tilted slightly as if he'd heard it, as if he might have understood the rhythm of laughter, but chose not to acknowledge it. Or perhaps he didn't hear it at all. Perhaps the sound was never spoken aloud, but passed in a glance, a smirk, a twitch of an eyebrow. In that moment, the hold felt less like a sentence, and more like a shared breath. There was another morning, usual only in its softness, when one of the older guards, a man whose name no one bothered to learn but whose hands were always stained with coal, dust, walked the length of the lower deck and with a motion too fast to count left a half loaf of bread behind a barrel. It wasn't fresh. It was probably discarded from an officer's tray, hardened at the edges, spotted with the beginnings of mold, but it was food, left not with words, but with absence, with a space where a reprimand might have been, and wasn't. The prisoners noticed. Everything was noticed here. Every sound, every gesture, every deviation from the script. But no one moved toward the bread immediately. That would have broken the spell. They waited respectfully for the shadows to shift, and then the boy, the small one with a birthmark like a teardrop under his left eye, drifted over and claimed it, eyes wide, grateful, in the way children are when they've forgotten how to feel safe, but remember how to say thank you without speaking. The guard didn't return that way again, whether out of guilt, or orders, or indifference, no one knew. But that moment lived on, repeated in whispers long after the crust had been eaten and the hunger returned. And then there was the boy himself, not just for the bread, but for the way he spent his afternoons, when there was nothing to do and nothing to say, drawing ships in the thin dust that settled between the floorboards. He never spoke of them. He just knelt quietly, his back to the light, and used his finger to trace holes and masts and sails, sometimes with tiny flags drawn at impossible angles. No one interrupted him. Even the other prisoners gave him space, stepping over his invisible fleet, as though they were real vessels docked in a real harbor, and not just imaginings in dust. One day, someone left him a piece of charcoal, snapped from a burnt beam. No one claimed it. No one needed to. The boy's drawings became darker, more detailed, more sure. He never said what the ships were called, or where they were going, but everyone watched them grow, and somehow, in watching, they too remembered this not as a prison boundary, but as possibility. These flickers weren't frequent. They didn't come on schedule, but they stitched their days together, like thread through canvas, holding the unraveling edges just enough to keep the fabric whole. A song hummed under breath, not by old Tom this time, but by the man who used to play violin before his hands stiffened in the cold. A scrap of paper found beneath a crate with a poem on it, badly written, but unmistakably tender. A cough followed by a hand on a shoulder, not to silence it, but to acknowledge it. A story shared about a dog left behind, remembered not for its loyalty, but for the warmth of its fur in winter. Even dreams were shared sometimes, not boldly, not in groups, but between bunkmates, between moments of fading consciousness. "I dreamed of cherries," one man murmured. "Of biting into them. The juice was real. No one laughed. No one questioned. It was enough to say it. To believe, for a heartbeat, that the world outside still had such things. And then there were the guards, some of them, not all who, while no less bound by uniform, no less capable of cruelty, sometimes lingered a second longer near the sick. One of them once sat beside a dying prisoner and recited the Lord's Prayer in a voice so soft it barely moved the air. No one was sure why. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was habit, perhaps it was simply what he had been taught to do in the face of death. But it was a sound of comfort, of order, of familiarity. And in that moment, the hull of the ship, the groan of the wood, the weight of the chains, none of it mattered. What mattered was that someone spoke aloud, not to command, not to accuse, but simply to acknowledge that a life was ending. Later, no one spoke of it, but they remembered. They always remembered. Memory was the only possession they were allowed to keep. These moments didn't undo the suffering. They didn't rewrite the laws or loosen the iron, but they lingered in glances, in echoes, in the rhythm of shared silence. They were fragile, easily broken, quickly forgotten, if not tended to with reverence. And yet, they persisted, like moss on stone, like stars behind smoke. They were what made the men human, even when the world around them insisted they were not. They were not mercy. They were not salvation. They were something smaller, and in that smallness, they were everything. Over time, it wasn't just the limbs that stiffened or the skin that broke under the damp pit. Was the mind that began to fold in on itself, not in madness, but in softness, in surrender, in the quiet erosion. That comes not from a single blow, but from the absence of anything new. When the body is confined long enough, the soul begins to shrink to match it, like fabric left too long in water, losing its shape. A man who hasn't seen the sky for months begins not to miss it, but to question if it was ever real. If the color blue was as he remembered, or if it was something invented by stories passed between bunks. The sun becomes less of a memory and more of an idea, vague and uncertain, like a half-remembered lullaby. Some tried to trace it in dust, or mutter its shape in sleep, but it slipped away, just out of reach. Instead of the sky, there were planks. Instead of breezes, there was breath, thick, stale, human breath shared by too many lungs. And when the light failed to change, when the rhythm of time flattened into repetition, the mind did what it had to do. It reached inward. It built spaces behind the eyes, quiet gardens of sensation that no guard could search. Men began to dream not only when they slept, but when they blinked. Some would lie with eyes half closed and murmur things not to others, but to themselves, small conjurings of memory or invention. One man, a former cooper with hands now too swollen to hold a chisel, whispered of mango trees, not just the fruit, but the way the leaves moved in wind. He had been a boy once, in a place where the sun filtered through the trees like gold through cloth. In his mind, he plucked the mango carefully, felt the fuzz against his thumb, smelled the sugar before it touched his lips. He never said where the tree was. Perhaps it was real. Perhaps not. Another spoke, only once, of a woman's voice, not her face, not her name, just the voice, the way it said his name, without judgment. He didn't speak it aloud again. Some things were too fragile. Dreams became a currency more valuable than bread. And not only the dreams at night, but the small waking visions, the memory of a mother's hands, rough but sure, the shape of a child's drawing pinned to a hearth once warm, the way a church bell sounded in winter muffled through scarf and frost. These things surfaced unbidden, gifts from a mind desperate for variation. They were not always accurate, but accuracy was not the point. Sometimes, just remembering color was enough to sleep a little. The thought of red a berry, a ribbon, a coat, was enough to soften the plank beneath you. Green could make a meal stretch further. Yellow could make a cough seem smaller. There was a man, one who had once been a schoolteacher before a dispute over land and lineage landed him in the hold, who used to recite poetry to himself, not for others, just quiet lines, over and over, like a rosary, not for faith, but for structure. He said the same stanza every night for weeks until it changed without warning. Not because he forgot, but because the rhythm had shifted in his dreams. A man's mind, when deprived of story, will begin to write its own. There was danger in this, of course. Some slipped too far. They began to speak to people who weren't there, to answer questions no one had asked. Their dreams overtook them, not as comfort but as fog. But for most, it was a balancing act. To remember just enough to survive, not so much that it hurt. Memory was a place with doors. Some knew which ones to open and which ones to leave closed. Some dreamed of the Sonata River, but the true sea, with its openness, its depth, its endless blue. They remembered the slap of waves, the call of gulls, the sting of salt on skin. A few had never even seen it in life, but dreamed it anyway, drawn by the stories of others, painting the sea from second-hand color. One man drew it in charcoal on the inside of his bunk, a line that dipped and rose, over and over, like breath. He called it the escape I can't make, but can ride. And then there were those who dreamed of silence, not the silence of a hulk, which was thick and pressing, but the silence of aloneness, of being in a field with no footsteps behind you, or in a room where the only sound was the ticking of a clock. They dreamed of being unobserved, of being unremembered by the system. Some whispered, in tones softer than prayer, that their best dreams were of walking, of simply moving forward with no wall, no ceiling, no eyes watching. Dreams didn't fix the hunger. They didn't stop the coughs, or the rot, or the ache that lived in the knees. But they made the hours more pliable. They gave shape to time, and for some, they were the last part of themselves they still owned. The guards never asked about dreams. They didn't care. But they noticed. They noticed when a man smiled in sleep, or wept, or murmured names long lost to the ledgers. They noticed, and turned away. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps because even they knew there was a line that, once crossed, made the hulk not just a prison, but a place outside time. And so, the men dreamed, in the stink, in the dark, in the hollow of each breath. They dreamed with eyes open, with mouths closed, with hands curled around the memory of something soft. And when the dreams faded, when the rotten rust pressed harder, when the chain bit too deep, they waited for the next one. Because in the end, dreaming was not escape. It was endurance. It was the last rebellion. Quiet, private, invisible. A sky, invented behind closed eyes, where the sun still rose. Georgian Britain, at a glance, often presents itself in a costume of refinement, powdered wigs perched atop thoughtful brows, gentlemen in tailored coats strolling through pleasure gardens, the click of polished boots across cobblestones, salons lit with oil lamps, where language was shaped into art and science was announced with the flourish of brass instruments and long, tapered quills. It was an age, we are told, of inquiry and reason, of natural philosophy and polite conversation, of grand houses where orchestras played beneath painted ceilings, and of great universities where ideas were measured as delicately as lace. It was, on its best days, a time of letters, of discovery, of expansion ships mapping the globe, clocks tracking stars, coins minted with symmetry and pride. But beneath that outer shell of civility and structure lay something quieter, something less gilded and far less frequently illuminated. Beneath the powdered wigs and velvet chairs was an entire substratum of life governed not by rationality, but by necessity. It was a world of rules written not only in law but in habit, in silence, in brick, and in rope. For every gentleman quoted in the coffee houses, there were 10 men with dirt beneath their nails, who could not read the headlines pinned outside. For every enlightened conversation had in a London drawing room, there were 100 muttered bargains made behind taverns, inside courtrooms, and within the hard geometry of prison cells. The British Empire, so often imagined in marbled halls and sea-borne glory, also floated much closer to home in the form of routing ships, tethered along its own riverbanks, their sails long gone, their decks stacked, not with goods but with men. These were the hulk ships, once war vessels, proud and purposeful. They had outlived their usefulness in battle, and were stripped of their noble roles, chained not to foreign conquest but to domestic despair. And so they sat, tethered to docks, their rigging removed, their hulls hollowed, turned from vessels of movement to containers of human stillness. The government called them a solution practical, cost, but those who stepped within knew them only as punishment in a place where the tide moved, but they could not. They floated not to explore, not to conquer, but to contain. People, time, breath, each one of them bore a name, a history, a charge scribbled in ink on fragile parchment. They were not soldiers, not sailors, not free, but they were there. These ships held more than they held systems, legal, bureaucratic, moral, that defined who was worth keeping and who could be discarded. Some men had stolen, some had begged, some had merely stood in the wrong place, or loved the wrong person, or owed the wrong debt at the wrong time. And yet, inside the hulk, all these distinctions dissolved into routine, into repetition, into the slow rub of rope against wrist. Above them, the city continued. The coffee was poured. The debates were had. The plays were staged. But beneath, in the shadows, these men waited, without wind, without purpose, without story. And that is where we begin tonight, not with the thinkers or the leaders or the battles carved into national memory, but with those whom time has largely chosen not to remember. The prisoners, the transported, the forgotten. First, we will slip quietly into the hold of a British hulk ship, where rust kisses wood and where the day is marked not by clocks but by. Then we will follow the life of a single woman, Mary Bryant, whose footsteps stretched from a small Cornish village to the far edges of an empire and back again, tracing arcs of loss, survival, and silent defiance. After that, our attention will turn northward, into colder waters, where another British expedition vanished into the Arctic with hope in its sails and lead in its bones. And finally, we'll end in a room bright with oil lamps and crowded with gentlemen of learning, where the Royal Society debated life, death, and frogs, surrounded by wine and powdered argument. Each story is its own tide, and you may follow them as closely or loosely as you wish. You may float with them, or drift into rest. The histories will hold their shape. What binds them together is not action or fame or even geography. What binds them is silence, the kind of silence that follows commands, that hides in law, that lingers in footnotes and prison ledgers, a rhythm of punishment, a tide of forgetting, a thread of breath in a sealed room. These are not stories of victory, but they are stories of and tonight they ask nothing of you but to listen, or not, to breathe, to drift, to feel the quiet press of another life, once lived, not loud, but real. She had not asked for the ocean, and yet the ocean took her. Mary Bryant, still Mary Broad then, boarded the transport not as a sailor or an emigrant but as a sentencer woman, convicted of petty theft in a corn war, pressed hard by weather, class, and hunger. She was young, perhaps younger than she admitted, her bones small from years of scant meals, her eyes not yet dulled by defeat, but already learning not to hope. The First Fleet, as it would later be called in textbooks and footnotes, was no grand migration. It was, in its essence, a logistical solution and experiment in exile conceived by men with ledgers, ink-stained fingers, and an interest in space. Britain's prisons were too full, its poor too numerous, its colonies in North America no longer viable places to send the unwanted. So the ships were built or refitted, and over 700 convicts, including Mary, were packed into their wooden hulls, like thoughtless cargo bound for the ends of the known world. The journey to Botany Bay stretched over 8 months, longer than any of them had imagined. Long enough for weeks to lose their edges, for calendars to collapse into tides and routines, and the slow, terrible rhythm of endurance. The ship creaked not with confidence, but fatigue. It had carried rum once, or wool, now it carried lives. The air grew thick within its decks, heavy with the stink of too many bodies and too little fresh water. Salt clung not just to the skin but to the throat, to the tongue, to every breath. Rations were predictable in their meagerness. Hard biscuit, salted meat, the occasional scoop of weaver-laced porridge. Hunger became something not to be fought, but folded into an ache, to be carried like a child, a silent companion on the journey. Sickness spread as quickly as rumor. Dysentery, scurvy, fever names, whispered at night, growing louder by morning. There was little medicine, and even less pity. A man who coughed one day might vanish the next, and no one would speak of it. Women gave birth in the dark. Children cried and were quieted. Guards walked slowly above, boots echoing through the beams, their pace steady and detached. Below, the convicts lived in a suspended world, neither truly alive nor permitted to die. Mary was pregnant during that voyage, the child growing inside her, fed by what little she could manage to stomach. She felt it turn gently, as if wondering where it was being taken. No midwife was assigned, no ceremony marked the birth. Only a scream, then silence, then a life added to the roster of the unwanted. When they finally arrived at Botany Bay, it was not the land that greeted them, but its distanced so far from anything they had known, that even the trees looked like questions. The coast was dry, the soil stubborn, the sun indifferent. The British flag had been planted months before, but the land itself had not accepted it. The colony was not a town, but an arrangement: tents, shovels, soldiers, sentences. Mary, now with a newborn in her arms, stepped into this space as though onto the surface of a thought never completed. The other women clustered together, forming routines, out of necessity. Boiling roots, washing linen, whispering about the past as though it had happened to someone else. The men built shelters, dug latrines, died. There were few tools, fewer comforts. Water came with effort, meat less so. For Mary, each day became a test of choices: where to step, what to say, how not to be seen by the wrong eyes. She married William Bryant, a fellow convict, perhaps for love, perhaps for safety, perhaps because naming someone as kin made the land feel less foreign. He was quiet, steady, capable with nets and knots, and together they tried to build something from what little was offered. She gave birth again, this time with slightly more space to breathe. The child cried, a small rebellion against the silence of the penal colony. But freedom did not follow. Mary watched the horizon with the eyes of a woman who counted not days, but absences of letters, of warmth, of change. The heat was relentless, not fierce, but consistent, a slow burn that took more from them than they realized. The settlement was watched, of course. Guards stood with rifles, officers kept ledgers, decisions were made by those whose tents were larger. Yet within the colony, among the convicts, a different order emerged. Small favors, shared bread, the barter of stories. And in Mary, something hardened. Not bitterness, there was no space for that, but clarity. She would not die here. She did not shout. She learned, she watched the tide. At night, she listened to the wind, counted the waves, remembered the shape of sails, the sound of oars in water. She did not speak of escape, not yet, but she began to trace it in silence. The map she needed lived behind her eyes, the courage within her spine. Australia had not claimed her, it had only held her, for now. And, somewhere, far beyond the surf, was a line not drawn on any chart, a line between punishment and possibility. Mary did not wait to be saved. She learned to navigate the spaces no one was watching. That, too, was survival. She had waited long enough, not in a frantic panic, not in a fever of escape, but in the quiet, deliberate patience of someone who had spent every day watching the sea and letting her resolve simmer beneath silence. Mary Bryant, her husband William, their 2 young children, and a handful of other convicts, each worn thin by the Australian sun and the colony's ceaseless hunger, stepped into a plan that was neither loud nor reckless. It was, instead, something forged by repetition, by the practice of enduring. They stole a small boat, no grand vessel, not a schooner with sails and space, but a cutter, a humble wooden craft, perhaps meant to ferry supplies, not dreams. And in that modest shell, they carried not only themselves but a risk so vast, it felt like another passenger. Over 3,000 miles of ocean stretched between them and their goal, the Dutch-controlled island of T, where they believed anonymity might taste like freedom, and British authority would be, if not absent, at least delayed. It was not a journey plotted on neat maps. It was traced by memory, by rumor, by the gentle folds of hope stitched into each paddle's arc. They sailed north, hugging the coast when they could, crossing open sea when they must, the boat heavy with bogies, and even heavier with intention. They rationed water, chewed dried fish, and spoke sparingly. There was no romance in their voyage, only wind, sun, and the endless repetition of blue. Tropical storms came, not with warning but with teeth. The skies would darken, the air would still, and then the rain would come not as gentle mist, but as sheets that pounded their skin and erased the horizon. Waves tossed the boats like a child's toy, and every plank creaked with questions. They bailed with their hands. They sang to keep rhythm. They whispered prayers. The sun returned, but not as comfort. It burned without apology, turning skin raw, lips cracked, eyes weary from squinting into glare, and yet they pressed forward. Each day brought both victory and danger. They evaded Dutch patrols by dressing in stolen fabric, pretending to be local traders when they could, crouching in reeds when they couldn't. William's hands grew calloused from rowing. Mary learned to read the wind by scent, to tie knots by feel. The children became quiet shadows of themselves, more alert than playful, watching their parents with wide, salt-bright eyes. Sickness crept in, low fevers, sores that refused to heal, a cough that rattled too long in a man's chest. Still, they sailed. Each new island, each inlet, each night they were not captured, felt like another heartbeat earned. When they reached Timor, it was with salt in their hair, sun on their backs, and hope clinging to their breath. For a brief, impossible moment, it seemed they had done it. Disguised, weary, and cautious, they passed themselves off as shipwrecked travelers. And for a few days, the illusion held. They tasted real food. They lay on real beds. They heard music again, and language that didn't bite. But the world, orderly in its cruelty, was not so easily fooled. A visiting Dutch official, curious about their accents, their story, their clothes, began asking questions. And then it came apart. British identity, once a burden, now betrayed them. They were recognized, rearrested, and re-imprisoned, this time with the taste of freedom still on their tongues. The re-entry into captivity was worse not because of conditions, but because of contrast. What had once been the only life now felt like a theft. William Bryan, who had steered them through rain and reef, fell ill. The sickness that had lingered throughout the voyage now took hold fully. He weakened quickly, his skin turning pale, his words softening into silence. Mary held his hand. There was no treatment, only observation. He died quietly, far from Cornwall, far from anything that had ever loved him. Their young son followed soon after. The illness did not discriminate. A fever came, a breath failed, and then, like so many before them, the child disappeared into absence. Mary, who had crossed oceans, who had fed hope with every tide, remained. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She bore grief as she had borne hunger, as she had borne confinement as a weight she could not afford to drop. She was eventually returned to Britain, not as a hero, not even as a cautionary tale, but as an administrative loose end. The courts, unsure what to do with a woman who had endured so much for so little reward, debated her fate quietly. Public sympathy stirred faintly. Writers and thinkers admired her resilience. A small campaign for mercy emerged, and at last she was freed. But by then, freedom had changed. It no longer meant land or marriage or escape. It meant breathing without command, walking without direction, remembering without needing to explain. Mary lived the rest of her life, not loudly, not as a figure of rebellion or icon of resistance, but as a woman who had once sailed through storms-buried love beneath foreign skies, and returned with nothing but her name. Her story survives not in monuments, not in songs, but in court records, scattered pages, and the soft awe of those who learn it. Her escape was not only physical, it was existential. It was the proof that even in a world built to hold you, to punish you, to define you by your worst mistake, the current could still be crossed. That hope, however brief, could still carry you even if it stung like salt. She returned not with celebration, but with silence. Mary Bryant, once Mary Broad of Cornwall, stepped back onto British soil, not as a hero nor as a figure of scandal, but as something quieter. A woman who had slipped through the cracks of empire and come home by way of storms, hunger, and death. Her chains clinked softly on the docks of London, more symbolic than necessary now, as if to remind the watchers and scribes and officials that though she had travelled far, she was still, in the eyes of the system, unfinished. But the world into which she returned had shifted just slightly. Newspapers had printed her name. Writers had told her story in fragments, some romanticized, others factual, all intrigued. The public, often more sentimental than the state, found in her tale something unsettlingly noble. A thief, yes, but a convict, but also a sailor, a woman, but also a survivor. There was no trial this time, no new sentence to be carried out. The years of exile, the ocean crossed, the family buried, those were punishment enough, and perhaps more than what had been intended. The court, watching the tides of public opinion rise, granted her a pardon, not out of guilt, perhaps, nor justice, but something more. And the quiet unease of knowing that the law had done what it had set out to do and still lost the moral ground. She walked free, no parade awaiting her, no relatives cheering, just the rhythm of London returning to itself, the creak of carts, the call of vendors, the persistent fog rising off the river. She was no longer a convict, but neither was she truly a citizen. She was something in between. She took up small work, avoided attention, blended into the city's breathing mass. Her name would appear again only in the margins on census rolls, perhaps, or the edge of a parish note. She had no monuments, no statue raised in her honor, no bust in Westminster to mark her defiance, and yet she endured. Her survival, brutal, improbable, uninvited, became her legacy. She had crossed an ocean, survived childbirth on the high seas, escaped a prison colony, weathered storms, endured loss deeper than any court could sentence, and returned not broken, but present. That alone made her exceptional. She was punished for surviving poverty, and remembered for surviving history. In time, her name would be spoken in historied rooms and read in dusty books, not as a rebel, not as a martyr, but as a woman who endured what most would not have, who crossed the world in search of breath, and who returned not in triumph, but in existence. Her children did not survive. Her husband lies buried far from the soil of his birth. But she somehow continued, and in that quiet continuation, there is meaning. Not every survivor builds a movement. Not every escape leads to glory. Some just lead home. And that, too, is worth remembering. She disappeared into London's fog, not because she wished to vanish, but because the world had no place for her story to shine. But she is there still, in the mist, in the lull between steps, in the breath that fogs a window on a cold morning. She crossed oceans. She held her family in her arms while waves tried to take them. She buried them with dignity when they could fight no longer. And then she came home, not as the girl she had been, but as something else shaped by tide and time and the ache of memory. Her tale is not loud, it does not shout, it does not demand. It simply remains, like the echo of an oar in distant water, like salt on skin long after the sea is gone. Whether you're curled up in your favorite corner of the couch or lying beneath a soft quilt while the last light of the day slips away behind drawn curtains, this moment is yours. You don't need to do anything right now. There is no deadline here, no decisions to make, no expectation to stay alert. If your eyes are open, they may begin to drift closed. If they're already closed, then perhaps your breath has already slowed. The hum of the room around you, the gentle creak of a wall, the faint rustle of fabric as you shift slightly, the rhythmic pulse of your own heartbeat, these are the only things that need your attention. You're here, and that's more than enough. The world beyond this moment can wait. And in its place, there's only quiet, not silence, exactly, but something softer, something slower, the low whisper of a voice, the rhythm of old words, of stories untangled like threads in the dusk. This is a space where time can drift, where the past becomes texture rather than timeline, where what matters isn't what you remember, but how it feels to simply listen to drift with the current of a life long ago. Tonight, we begin not with battle cries or declarations, but with something far less noisy and far more human. Not with kings atop thrones or armies crossing borders, but with people made of breath and bone, caught in the stillness that history often forgets. This is not history for conquest or glory. This is history for sleep, for quiet, for exhale. You may hear words like expedition or empire, but you won't need to chase them. Let them pass like clouds. Let them wash over you like a tide that asks nothing in return. There will be ships, yes, but they won't move quickly. There will be names, but you don't need to memorize them. There will be loss, but spoken gently, as if remembered in a dream. You are not expected to follow every thread. You are not being quizzed. You are being respectfully through stories that once mattered deeply to those who lived them, and now linger quietly like the scent of old paper and sea salt. Perhaps the air around you is still now. Perhaps there's a breeze coming in through a cracked window. Perhaps the hum of a distant appliance anchors you to the present while your thoughts begin to shift. Whatever surrounds you, let it be your companion. The past we'll wander into tonight doesn't demand anything more. It only asks that you rest, that you let the tension slip out of your shoulders, that you let the rhythm of these words become a kind of lullaby, not in tune or rhyme, but in gentle, drifting cadence. The voices you'll meet in these stories are not shouting, they are not pleading, they are waiting. Some on ships, some in chains, some beneath snow, and some behind locked doors, where silence was the loudest sound of all. We begin, as always, with stillness, with a moment of quiet, with a breath. Inhale and let it go. Let it go again. Feel the weight of the day slide off your thoughts like a coat slipped gently from your shoulders. There's no need to hold it anymore. There's no need to reach forward or look back. Everything you need is in the softness of this moment. A lamp glowing dimly. The faint impression of your body beneath a blanket. A voice, low and calm, inviting you to follow not with your feet or your mind, but simply with your presence. Whether you drift off in the middle or linger through the end, the story will be here. The voices will continue, steady and unhurried. You are not required to stay awake. You are not expected to stay focused. History will carry itself. You are free to rest. You are free to sleep. This is a story told in low tones and long shadows, in details that unfurl like ribbon, in footsteps muffled by snow, in breaths that fog against glass. There will be cold places and warm voices. There will be failure and hope and the quiet middle ground between. But none of it will rise above a whisper. None of it will demand. You are safe here. You are still. You are at the edge of something slow and soft, and all that's asked of you is this. Let go. Let go of the tightness in your jaw. Let go of the list in your mind. Let go of the need to understand every fact. You are not here for facts. You are here for feeling, for quiet, for sleep. And if you do not sleep, that's fine too. Simply listen, simply drift, simply be. We'll begin shortly, with ships that creaked against ice and men who vanished into white. But for now, nothing is required. In and out, that's enough. That's always been enough. The story is waiting. You are ready. They sailed not toward land, but toward white endless. Unknowable white, not the white of parchment or porcelain, but of silence incarnate, of stillness given shape. Before they vanished, before the maps were stained with question marks and hope became hypothesis, there was order. There were uniforms, buttoned carefully to the collarbone, brass glinting in pale English sun, wool pressed and folded, polished boots stepping with practiced rhythm onto damp stone docks. There were crates, hundreds of them each, marked and catalogued, filled with preserved meats, lemon juice for scurvy prevention, dried peas, tobacco, ink, combs, and books. Always books, ledgers, manuals, Bibles, poetry each word, packed with the same methodical purpose as salted beef. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were not haphazard vessels. They were fitted with the latest in British ingenuity, steam engines, iron reinforcements, enclosed heating systems. One ship had once bombarded French coasts, the other had already braved Antarctic waters. These were not vessels of chance. They were, in theory, unsinkable ambassadors of empire. Sir John Franklin, in his late 50s, carried titles and medals, and the weary hope of resurrection this was his last command, and perhaps, in some quiet place, in the recesses of his mind, he knew it. The men of 100 of them bore their own stories, now mostly erased by frost. Sailors, officers, marines, engineers, some fresh from city taverns, others veterans of voyages past. They wrote letters. Some joked, most believed, as men often do when standing beside rigging and polished rails, that they were heading into something hard but manageable. They did not sail toward mystery, they sailed toward purpose, toward glory, toward filling in the last empty spaces on the world's proudest map. London faded behind them, and ahead stretched the undraped, not in danger, but in destiny. The Northwest Passage, long theorized, long sought, was not imagined as a graveyard. It was imagined as a corridor, a secret hallway through the frozen spine of the New World, a way to thread Asia and Europe without rounding capes and braving monsoons. They would find it. They were certain, with chronometers ticking calmly, with decks scrubbed to shine, with powdered wigs packed carefully beside woolen socks. They departed. Springs still clung to the Thames, but they moved toward something else entirely. Toward latitude lines few had crossed. Toward ice charts dotted with speculation. Past Greenland, past Baffin Bay, past the places where whales dove and icebergs watched with slow indifference. The ships were heavy with optimism. Though the air thinned, the further they went. There was laughter, early on. Games played on deck. Routines maintained. The officers dined separately, with better cutlery. But the men sang, worked, argued, and dreamed. Sometimes they looked at the white horizon and felt awe. Other times, unease. The farther north they crept, the less they knew. Inuit guides were sometimes offered and just as often ignored. Confidence hung in the rigging, taut and shining. But the white waited. It always waited. And the further they pushed into it, the less the maps resembled truth. Seals bobbed in the surf, impassive. Winds shifted. And then ice. Not sudden, but insistent. First a glint, then a crackle, then a field, then an ocean of frozen glass. The Erebus and Terror pressed forward slow, creaking, deliberate. The men watched, their breath curled in the lamplight. The ship groaned, the world quieted. There were no ports here, no friendly ships, no coastal towns or native fires, just white, and more white, and more white still. They sailed not toward land, but toward white. There was no blaze of glory, only slow, frostbitten, unmaking. There were no trumpets to announce their final camp, no newspapers to record the last words spoken between men whose breath lingered longer than their footsteps. The ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were Lancaster Sound in the summer of 1845, their decks tidy, their flags unfrayed, their men unaware that they were already disappearing. From that point on, nothing official returned. No signal flags, no distress cannons, only silence. For years, the British Admiralty waited, at first with confidence, then with worry, then with bureaucratic dread. They had been supplied for years. Surely they had wintered somewhere safe, mapped some stretch of passage, planted some flag. Surely, the Arctic holds secrets in the way snow covers tracks it. Doesn't resist inquiry, it absorbs it. What we know of their final months does not come from journals left behind, or frozen dispatches pinned to ice walls. It comes in fragments. Bones found gnawed or scattered, tin cans stacked in, collapsed, cans, buttons worn, thin by wind. It comes from the memories of those who watched from a distance, the Inuit, whose knowledge was long dismissed, whose stories carried the shape of truth. They spoke of men walking on the ice, hollow-eyed, dragging sledges, burdened more with symbolism than sustenance. Men pulling china plates and Bibles across white nothingness, choosing memory over meat. The Inuit told of camps, of smoke, of thin voices. They told of a ship scene trapped in the ice, of another abandoned, of a party trying to walk south, step after step, mile after mile, until footsteps gave way to stillness. These were not tales of savagery or conquest. They were tales of men unraveling beneath skies that held no sun, just pale circles that marked neither noon nor mercy. When search parties were finally sent, years too late, they found little. Letters buried in stone caches, ink faded but still speaking of confidence. Skeletons half buried, knees drawn to chests. A note dated April 1848, stating that the ships had been abandoned and that Sir John Franklin was dead. The handwriting was cramped, the message clipped. There were no florid farewells, just facts, and then silence. Later, when forensic studies were performed on exhumed remains, the clues became gray. Poisoning, likely, from poorly soldered food tins. Starvation, not as savagery, but as the final thread of survival snapped under frost. Not dramatic, just desperate. They did not fall in glorious battle. They did not sink in a storm. They faded. They waited too long. They trusted too much in technology and too little in humility. And as the temperature dropped, so did their strength. Fingertips blackened, joints stiffened, lungs slowed. No blaze of glory. A man sleeping in his coat, another crawling toward a sun that wouldn't rise, another holding a spoon he could no longer lift, one by one. Quietly. And still, the Arctic said nothing. It kept their stories frozen, piece by piece, until modern eyes could not tell them apart. The final image is not of a flag planted triumphantly in tundra, but of boots half buried in snow, of gloves clenched, of white, endless white. Some bones bore marks, not of violence, but of desperation's last language. They were found slowly, over decades, scattered across what once was ice and now is stone. The first artifacts emerged in the 1850s buttons utensils, bits of cloth, but it was only much later that the evidence began to speak in full sentences. Forensic teams, working under overcast skies and amid rocks worn, smooth by wind. Some skulls bore faint, circular grooved traces of trepanation, or perhaps simply the collapse of flesh. Long bones, femurs, and tibias showed linear scoring cuts, made not in rage, but in resignation. They were not wounds of attack. They were choices made in moments beyond survival, when the body became memory, and memory became ration. It is a story of what remains when all else disappears. Scientists found elevated levels of lead in preserved soft teas, especially in the bones of younger crew members, whose bodies still clung to trace toxins. The culprit was likely the solder used to seal hundreds of food tins. When heated and stored for long periods, the lead leached slowly into the meat, into the vegetables, into the preserved puddings meant to comfort men in the dark. And so, every bite brought with it a future corrosion of the mind, confusion, weakness, hallucinations. But the men did not know this. They ate what was rationed, what was stored, what was counted by naval quartermasters thousands of miles away. They followed the schedule, even as their bodies betrayed them. Some graves were marked with wooden planks, still legible. Others were nothing more than shallow depressions, discovered only by the way moss refused to grow evenly. And within those graves, teeth were clenched, spines curled, bones curled like fists. DNA confirmed identities, but names mattered less than stories. A crewman who once scrubbed the deck, an officer who wrote a final note in trembling script, a marine who never made it off the ship. Their remains spoke not in screams, but in alignment, in positioning, in absence. Their boots were sometimes still present, the soles intact, the leather worn. The bones, within telling of short stature, of stress, of hours stood in cold with weight on one foot more than the other. Their ribs told of scurvy, their joints of arthritis, their clothes, what remained of them, spoke of British naval order, but the word told of time and repetition. In some locations, tin cans were found piled, opened roughly, some pierced crudely, by knife or spike. These were not the actions of men enjoying dinner. These were the choices made when hunger outlived habit. Tools were found near bones, sometimes arranged, sometimes discarded. A spoon near a hand, a pipe with no tobacco, a comb with no hair. There were no maps, no journal of the end, no detailed account of how or when the final hours passed. But the bones held the record, quietly, without judgment. Some had cut marks near joints, carefully analyzed, carefully reported, never sensationalized. Not of murder, not of cruelty, but of final measures. Final options. The way one might cut rope to use the fibers. The way one might split wood to reach the dry core. Not violence. Desperation's last language. The language of the cold. Of the final weeks. Of hope, folded in layers of wool and sealed beneath snow. For a century, these findings were debated, dismissed by some, embraced by others. But the bones remained constant. They did not argue. They simply sat, waited, and offered what they had. Silence, and the shape of truth. They told of men who were not reckless, but who were undone by conditions they could not predict and by confidence that did not account for humility. They told of suffering that was organized. Even in starvation, the remains show signs of routine. Camps arranged in a circle. Artifacts distributed evenly. Death did not come all at once. It came slowly. It came with respect. It came with ritual. The Arctic preserved more than bones. It preserved the quiet dignity of men trying to do what they had been taught. Endure, report, survive. When they could do no more, they left behind what could speak for them. Some bones bore marks, not of violence, but of desperation's last language. And in that silence, they became more than sailors. They became storytellers. And the story they told was not of failure, but of the limits of preparation, the cost of isolation, and the quiet finality of white, endless white. They left to find a way through, and instead became the thing that was found. What had begun as a confident expedition armed with charts, steam engines, preserved food, and enlightenment, certainty ended in whispers carried across centuries. Franklin, once a middling naval officer with ambitions too large for his prior failures, became something far greater in death than he had ever been in life. He became legend, a name etched into textbooks and polar maps. His failure rewritten as bravery, his disappearance transfigured into myth. The Victorian public, starved for tales of valor and empire, transformed the vanished men into martyrs of progress. Paintings were made Franklin standing nobly on deck, hand raised, icebergs looming, like cathedral walls behind him. Plays were written, statues erected. His wife, Lady Jane Franklin, petitioned endlessly, her grief alchemized into lobbying, until the Admiralty was forced to fund voyage after voyage in search of the lost ships. And still, the Arctic remained silent. Decades passed. Generations rose and fell. The white held its secret. It became a place of speculation, of ghost stories, of conspiracy. Were they betrayed? Did they rebel? Did they survive longer than we think? Scratching years into stones, building shelters, speaking less and less until silence itself was home. In time, searchers found relics, cutlery, buttons, a shoe, and then more. And then at last ships. First, Erebus, later, Terror, found in remarkably preserved condition beneath icy waters, resting calmly, as though waiting for an audience that had simply taken the long way. The wrecks were still, the wood swollen but intact, glass windows glinting faintly under sea light. Storage compartments still closed as though the voyage had simply paused. No bodies on deck, no messages on the walls. Divers entered with reverence, whispering beneath their breath, the silt of history swirling gently around them. It was not an exhumation, it was a visitation. What the sea had hidden, time had softened. The mystery, while now mapped and measured, had not lost its aura. Because myth is not built from fact, it is built from longing. And Franklin's fate, bleak, quiet, unsolved for so long, offered a canvas for every kind of projection. Imperial, tragic, noble, absurd. Some saw in him the persistence of the human spirit. Others saw hubris, colonial arrogance, a cautionary tale. But perhaps what lingers most is the image of ships setting off with full sails and brass polished to shine, and then simply not coming back. The silence spoke louder than any dispatch. The frost wrote no names, but remembered every footstep, and the story became ours to tell. In museums today, you can see some of the artifacts preserved: boots, navigational tools, spoons with initials carved in. But the real legacy is less tangible. It is the haunting quiet of those final months, the stubborn endurance, the slow transformation of men into memory. Franklin and his crew did not find the Northwest Passage. They did not redraw maps or link oceans. But they taught something else. That there are places which resist conquest. That the human body, though brave and clever, is not built for endless white. That loss, when it leaves no witnesses, becomes something sacred. And when the ships were finally seen again, after more than 150 years, they did not announce themselves with wreckage and drama. They simply rested. Silent, still, found. They left to find a way through, and instead became the thing that was found. Beneath the amber hush of candlelit domes, the Royal Society stirred to life in slow, deliberate rhythms. The room was not grand by cathedral standards, but it held a kind of quiet majesty built, not of height or opulence, but of intent, a chamber made for thought rather than. High ceilings loomed in the flicker of oil-fed chandeliers, their iron arms holding waxen tapers that dripped slowly, steadily, onto brass plates below. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, polished to a muted sheen, bearing the occasional dent from a cane, a ring, a hurried elbow. Mahogany banisters traced the edges of the upper gallery, their edges smooth where countless hands had rested, tapped, or curled in silent consideration. The floor was waxed wood, bearing the soft scuff of leather soles, and the echoing creak that announced every movement. Velvet drapes framed tall windows, drawn shut against the chill of London's evening fog, which clung to the coats of guests as they arrived, wool coats, faintly sour with dampness, edged in soot from passing carriage wheels. The air inside was warmer still, touched by the lingering scents of pipe tobacco and old books of candle wax thick in the corners, and of something faintly chemical, sulfur perhaps, or the echo of a preserved specimen uncorked earlier in the day. A long table dominated the room's center, its surface marked with rings from glasses of sherry, with scratches from brass instruments, with the irregular stains of ink that had blotted hastily taken notes. Glass domes lined its middle, each containing something still, strange, or slowly decaying in. Ashen bird's skull with feathers still clinging to bone. A coil of copper wire fixed between hand-cut magnets. A frog suspended in spirits, its limbs arched in a posture that suggested motion or resistance. At the head of the room stood a lectern, modest and heavy, worn smooth at the edges where hands had gripped it nervously before beginning. Behind it, a wide chalkboard bore equations half a rest, as if someone had stopped mid-thought and never returned. The light in the room was gentle, not designed for spectacle, but for shadows cast by the flickering candles shifted slowly on the walls, mirroring the slow pace of ideas exchanged across the chamber. Voices spoke softly. Conversation here was a current, not a tide low, steady, always polite. When someone cleared their throat, it echoed delicately in the rafters before vanishing into the velvet. When a chair was pushed back, the legs whispered against waxed wood. When a cane tapped in rhythm to its owner's contemplative pacing, it did so like a second hand on a distant clock. There were no sudden movements, no loud exclamations, only murmurs, the scratch of nib on parchment, the soft pop of a cork removed from a vial, the crisp fold of linen as a handkerchief was returned to a lapel, the clink of spectacles as someone adjusted them for a clearer view of a preserved insect wing held delicately between tweezers. The men wore layers, waistcoats, frock coats, scarves, tucked carefully, not for warmth, but for etiquette. Powdered wigs, framed faces, drawn long by contemplation, not malice. No one here shouted. No one gestured wildly. Hands remained close to bodies. Words were chosen not for their force, but their lineage. The architecture encouraged such restraint. Every detail, the geometry of the ceiling coffers, the symmetry of the chandeliers, the spacing between seats whispered that reason lived here, that emotion had its place elsewhere. On each wall, shelves held volumes bound in leather, some too old to open without a puff of dust. Others sat with papers, tucked carefully inside, reports on media trails, on the nervous responses of eels, on the behavior of gases under pressure. These texts did not demand to be read. They waited, patiently, for curious hands. Even the room's temperature was conducive to slowness. A slight chill near the windows, a soft warmth near the hearth. It did not distract, It simply existed, like the air in a tomb of thought, and above all, the sounds were few but constant. Clocks ticking in corners, their pendulums hidden but steady, chairs squeaking in a rhythm as scholars leaned forward, then back, the occasional sigh as a theory met quiet resistance, or as understanding settled like dust onto a well-worn floor. Occasionally, laughter low, respectful would ripple, like a breeze through the chamber, often in response to an anecdote about failed experiments or particularly ambitious claims made by French academies. And in between the dialogue and demonstration, there was waiting, not impatience, but the kind of waiting that precedes discovery. Gentle silence, during which a candle flickered, thought moved slowly. And so, the Royal Society breathed not loudly, not brashly, but in the manner of old halls and older minds. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of light served not to distract, but to focus. The architecture contained thought, like a flask contained spirit, safely, carefully, without waste. It was a space not designed to impress the outside world, but to encourage slow unravelings of the unknown. And so, within this carefully crafted silence, behind velvet and stone, the evening would continue steady, curious, and very, very still. In the hushed evenings of the Royal Society, hierarchy did not raise its voice, it cleared its throat gently and was immediately obeyed. Social order here was neither shouted nor enforced by decree, but woven intricately into posture, titles, pauses, and the subtle tilt of a head. The room, though ostensibly open to men of science, was layered with invisible lines, between those who were born to speak and those permitted only to listen, between those whose names opened doors and those who scribbled ideas in margins, hoping someone else might one day read them aloud. The nobility, with powdered wigs perfectly set and gloves never removed, not even to eat, occupied the front rows, close to the lector. Their presence was less about engagement than about quiet dominance. A raised eyebrow from Lord T could end a conversation before it began. Beside him, a younger baronet adjusted his cravat, but to signal impatience, the gesture seen and understood by all who knew how such threads were woven. Just behind them sat the professional men, physicians with round spectacles, barristers with ink-stained cuffs, engineers who had earned their seats through laborious demonstration. Their coats bore the sheen of wear. Their boots lacked polish, but held integrity. They nodded more often than they spoke, and when they did speak, it was with precision born of caution. Further back still, the orthodoxan fringe thinkers lined. Galeria, Scottish anatomist with a chronic cough and a frayed collar, his notes written on reused ledgers. A German mechanic with rough hands, silent but observant, clutching a small notebook smudged with graphite. A boy not older than 17, an assistant to a well-established astronomer, so rapidly that his ink splattered, leaving constellations of nervous blotches across his parchment. The room acknowledged them by their silence, not their presence. They were here, yes, but not yet fully present. The rituals were known to all, though seldom taught. One did not interrupt during the reading of a paper. To do so was unthinkable. One waited, even if the argument was flawed, even if the math made no sense, until the final line was read and the speaker bowed slightly from behind the lectern. Then and only then came the pause. A single beat, during which everyone made their silent judgment. A nod from a man with spectacles might mean the theory held merit. A folded arm and slow blink from a chemist meant it did not. Applause was gentle. Always gentle. To clap too loudly was to suggest one was trying to be heard more than the idea itself. A slight delay before clapping, just the briefest hesitation, spoke volumes. It meant the speaker was heard but not embraced. Not yet. Even the tools of courtesy were structured. Snuff boxes passed between seats like diplomatic letters. Each movement opened, offer, take, tap was choreographed to the point of muscle memory. Declining snuff was not rude if done with a subtle smile. Accepting it with enthusiasm, however, marked one as provincial. Between papers there were moments of quiet shifting. Coins tapped gently on chair arms to express restlessness as single shoe adjusted to signal. Boredom, the faintest rustle of silk as someone leaned to whisper an opinion not meant for public record. These were not disruptions. There were punctuation marks in the society's long sentence of reason. And then, of course, came the paper presentation. Not a performance, but a ritual. A man would rise, unfold a carefully creased sheaf of vellum, and read not for applause, but for inclusion. His voice would be low, deliberate, trained more in rhetoric than passion. He might begin with a gentle preface. Though unproven, the following observations may offer a modest contribution to our mutual understanding. The content varied: experiments with animal magnetism, new theories of atmospheric pressure, musings on the electrical impulses of dead frogs. Yet the format rarely changed. There was always deference, always footnote, always the suggestion that the truth, if it existed, lay somewhere just beyond the candlelight, and that perhaps if they listened closely enough it might reveal itself. Some ideas were tolerated, some were not. An elderly gentleman who had once proposed that lunar phases controlled the spread of melancholy was still permitted to attend, though no longer invited to speak. Another, who claimed to have distilled water that could remember the shape of pain, was gently but permanently forgotten. The society, for all its openness, had its boundaries marked not by signs, but by silence, and so the nights unfolded. A nobleman with immaculate gloves might make a comment about ether pressure, received with murmured assent. A physician, in turn, might suggest a revision, met with polite deflection. A fringe theorist, from the shadows, might offer a footnote quietly noted, rarely recorded. Meanwhile, the assistant in the corner continued to write, occasionally looking up with the wide eyes of someone trying to memorize the exact angle of respect. Outside, the city moved with soot and noise, but inside the Royal Society, time thinned. Thought moved in layers. The rituals were not designed to exclude, they were designed to maintain order. In a world where ideas could inflame revolution, could challenge pulpits and parliaments, the Society's great unspoken ambition was this: to allow the new to arrive gently, to be weighed, not waved, to be tested, not taken as truth without due ceremony. And in this soft order, each man found his place. The nobleman, the doctor, the tinkerer, the boy. They did not speak with equal voice, but they listened with shared silence. And that silence, thick as pipe smoke, hung between them not as emptiness, but as potential. Within it were all the ideas not yet spoken, all the theories still being shaped, all the questions too new to name. And in this layered quiet, one could almost forget the city outside, the fog, the filth, the clatter of hooves, and hunger. Here, behind wood-paneled walls and under flickering light, thought held court. And the ritual, however strange, however slow, continued, just as it always had, just as it would again. In the dim warmth of the chamber, beneath a ceiling kissed by soot and soothed by shadows, the air often held more than thought did, held curiosity, thick as velvet. There was no rush, no conclusion demanded. Here the Royal Society conducted its peculiar rituals not with finality, but with the tender touch of wonder. A table was drawn to the center of the room, its legs uneven on the floorboards, worn soft by decades of careful steps. Upon the table, not a crown or declaration, but a frog still, quiet, and caught in the realm between life and absence. Its limbs, preserved just enough to retain tension, lay draped over a sheet of polished copper. A wire was touched to its muscle, and as the copper and zinc met beneath it, a spark leapt invisibly and, just once, no gasp in the room, only a hush that deepened, not horror, not excitement, just that held breath of mind brushing against something unspoken. Was it life? Was it muscle memory? Or simply the inevitable reaction of matter arranged just so? No one declared an answer. That was not the way here. Instead, someone gently scribbled a note, dipping a pen into ink that shimmered like oil under candlelight, while others let silence speak the first commentary. This was not an age of knowing. It was an age of approaching, of circling questions like stars and hoping one might sing back. Sometimes, the experiments bordered on play. A gentleman with wiry spectacles once rubbed amber fur against a cat in the darkened parlor, then reached out and watched a thin thread of hair rise, as if whispering to unseen winds. Static, he called it. But what was it, really? Spirit, invisible fire, a remnant of soul. In another corner, a young man glued goose feathers, 2 cuttings of parchment, affixed them to hollowed tubes of whalebone, and released them from a library window. They fluttered, spun, sometimes caught an updraft and drifted a little further than expected. Ballooning, they said. And the question lingered like pipe smoke. Could man lift himself, not through sign or steam, but through feathers and air? The table welcomed all manners of material. Seeds preserved in amber, bones, etched with lines no one could translate, a metal disc found in a farmer's field that seemed to hum slightly when near. Nothing was discarded outright. Even failures were cradled in the velvet of continued consideration. Once, a glass vial was passed around inside a drop of rainwater that had fallen during an eclipse. Some claimed it tasted of iron, Others said it held no taste at all. It was studied nonetheless, and returned with reverence to its cushioned box. Philosophical questions did not hide here. They curled at the edges of diagrams, danced behind measurements. Could magnetism, some asked, draw not only iron, but mood? Could a man's sorrow be pulled from him like filings from wood? One physician kept a notebook filled only with times and locations of cloud shadows. Another attempted to measure silence in cathedral chambers, and always, above it all, the distant longing. Might the stars emit sound, not clamor, but harmonia chord only the heavens could hear? Instruments were devised, tuning forks set in motion within brass globes. One man even suspended a violin in a vacuum chamber, drawing the bow not for music, but for insight. He heard nothing, but he wrote down what he did not hear, and that, too, was data. Within this web of pondering stood men who believed, deeply, that truth was measurable, but also men who wondered if the attempt to measure might blur the very thing sought. One lecturer, his voice as thin as parchment, once whispered, "To name is not to know," a phrase that lingered longer than most equations. Some believed they were inching toward God, not through prayer, but through pulleys and prisms. Others simply liked the company of question marks. There was no uniform intent, only a shared quiet, and a willingness to sit beside the unknown without insisting it speak too quickly. There were failures, too. A tonic brewed from crushed beetles and winter moss meant to extend memory left one man feverish for 3 days. An attempt to measure the weight of light itself ended with shattered glass and the faint odor of burnt silk. Yet these were not viewed as shameful. They were simply the next stone in a path no one could fully see. And in the evenings, as candles burned lower and the air grew thicker, someone might bring forth a final curiosity. A map of lunar canals traced with trembling hand. A rock retrieved from a mine that bore patterns none could name. A poem carved in bone found beneath a monastery's cellar speaking in riddles of breath and dust. They did not clap loudly. They did not rush. The night unfolded slowly, like a paper flower dipped in warm water. Thought drifted across the room, catching in folds of curtain, curling in pipe bowls, settling into corners. Outside, London rattled with carts and shouts and soot. But inside the chamber of inquiry, time held still, cupped gently in gloved hands. The experiments, however odd, were not spectacle. They were meditations, not just on what the world was, but on what it might still be becoming. And in that becoming, the men of the society found purpose. They did not all understand what they saw, but they stayed, they watched, they listened, and sometimes, in the quiet twitch of a frog's leg or the flicker of static across a furrowed brow, they glimpsed not answers, but the grace of Baskinville. They gathered in rooms lit by candlelight and certainty, their wigs powdered, their gloves folded neatly at the wrist, the hum of learnt conversation rising like mist from a slow river. But beneath the flicker of their rational optimism sat a quiet dissonance they rarely named, because to name it would be to disturb the order they had spent their lives arranging. They measured light, yes, dissected frogs, charted the stars, mapped eclipses with a precision that bordered on reverence, but they did not measure the absence within their circle, the absences that smiled from behind service trays, or bowed politely at the threshold and were not invited in. They gathered to name the world, these men, to pin it down with Latin and ink, to divide it into genus and species, impulse and law. And they did so surrounded by the invisible labor of those whose names would never accompany the footnotes, whose observations passed through cloth-covered mouths and never reached the page. A young servant might brush by with a tray of small biscuits and glasses of Madeira, head bowed, ears open, repeating silently to himself the names. He overheard electrum galvanism, heliotrope, trying to remember the sounds, even though no one would ever ask him what he thought. Upstairs, a woman might be copying her husband's manuscript, not her first, not her last, translating his scattered notes into something coherent, her own marginalia later erased, her phrasing repurposed, her silence repackaged as humility. They chased truth, these philosophers and naturalists, but always within boundaries they assumed were natural, not noticing who had drawn them. There was a visiting scholar once from Calcutta, a man of letters and logic, a translator of Newton and a commentator on the Vedas, who stood at the edge of a marble-floored chamber in Soho and waited 3 extra minutes before being introduced, not because he was unknown, but because no one could quite agree on what to call him. They smiled warmly, praised his knowledge, offered him wine but not citation. He answered their questions with grace, offered corrections with care, and later walked home alone beneath a moon he could chart in 3 languages. They would quote his insights over brandy that night, but forget, by morning, the shape of his name. In another room, not far from the Chamber of Frogs and Wires, sat a mystic once, invited by a curious patron, her eyes ringed with kohl, her speech slow and filled with metaphor. She spoke of harmony, of breath as energy, of herbs that sang and stars that listened, but when she left, they chuckled softly, noting that, while she was charming, she had offered no data. Her intuition did not appear in their ledgers, though one of them, weeks later, would write a paper inspired by a metaphor she used and forget to mention the source. It was the age of clocks, of measured moments, of ticking certainty, and yet their very gatherings ticked along a rhythm of exclusion too subtle to notice if you were never asked to stand outside. In the back of the hall, a printer's apprentice stood each week, taking down notes by hand. His job not to think, only to record, but he did think. He dreamed in diagrams. He imagined a new form of binding that would preserve pages from damp and mold. He saw connections between lectures that the speakers did not. But his name was never listed, not because he was wrong, but because he wasn't invited. Upstairs, a widow who once copied maps for the East India Company stared out her window, watching as carriages arrived at the Society's steps, each wheel turning like the orbit of a thought. She had once pursued and since relinquished. She wrote occasionally still, mostly in her ledger, mostly for herself. "They are building knowledge," she once wrote, "but the scaffolding is made of silence." They questioned everything, these men, except the spaces between their questions. They asked what air was made of, but not why some were allowed more of it. They wrote of liberty while investing in ships that carried chains. They laughed at superstition and lit candles for luck. They spoke of universality while debating who counted as part of the universe. They meant well, mostly. They were curious, passionate, even kind. But kindness is not the same as inclusion, and a curious gaze is not the same as an open door. Their mistakes were not always cruel. Sometimes they were simply ordinary omissions caused, not by malice, but by the softness of habit, by the quiet comfort of not asking where your ideas came from, or who helped shape them before you ever arrived at the lecture. Still, within the velvet and oak of their chambers, there was movement. A young girl once slipped into the back of a lecture, dressed as a boy, her notebook clutched tightly, her eyes wide with reverence. She was never discovered. Her notes still survive. A footman once memorized an entire paper on optics and recited it to his son by candlelight, who would later become a teacher. The knowledge leaked, as it always does, through cracks in the walls, through conversations half heard, through observations made in private gardens and behind closed doors. It is tempting, sometimes, to romanticize this world of powdered wigs and wax-sealed letters, to see only the wonder, the sparks, the scrolls, the meticulous etchings of moons and moths, and that wonder was real. But it sat, always, beside a forgetting of those who were there but not counted. And now, centuries later, the Royal Society remains, and the names are remembered: Hooke, Boyle, Newton, Halley. Their busts stand in alcoves, their papers are their ideas still echo in classrooms. But if you sit long enough with their words, if you breathe in the slow dust of archived pages, you begin to hear other rhythms too. The echo of footsteps in hallways where servants once stood, the half-erased signatures of women who transcribed lectures and passed them through families, the gentle footprints of scholars who were told their knowledge was fascinating but irrelevant. It was incomplete, not flawed in intent, but in attention. And to understand it is not to reject it but to widen its frame, to recognize that the light it chased always cast shadows, and that those shadows often held wisdom that the light missed. And they did, but they also obscured. And now, with quiet reverence, we remember both. The sparks and the silences, the names etched in stone, and the ones whispered only in kitchens. The servant who drew diagrams in chalk and wiped them away before anyone saw. The visitor who brought insight across oceans and took only half a bow. The woman who wrote the paper and signed her husband's name. They were not the center of the story, but they were its shape. And now, in the stillness of this room, in the hush of your own breath, you carry their memory not as correction, not as guilt, but as balance, as light turned gently toward the corners, as truth made softer, and therefore more complete. So rest here now. Let the candles sputter, let the clocks tick on. There is no urgency, only memory, unfolding slowly, like a forgotten page turned in moonlight. And in that turning, there is peace. And now, As the final traces of the evening fade into the hush of memory, we return once more to stillness, not with a triumphant conclusion, not with answers neatly bound, but with a slow unfolding of understanding that is, itself, the most honest legacy of history. A legacy not chiseled into stone or etched into metals, but whispered beneath breath, and carried forward by those who never made the portraits, whose names wore down faster than the buttons on their sleeves. You have drifted tonight through many forgotten rooms, through spaces lined not with gold but with shadows, prisons of wood that floated but never sailed, polar landscapes white with silence, and lost courts where science danced with snuff and silence and cells, both physical and social, where time passed slowly and memory was a rebellion. Now, gently, you sit with the weight of those moments, not to hold them tightly, but to let them settle like silt in a river, natural and quiet, part of the stream of thought. Beneath the decks of a British hulk ship you imagined a world where men breathed the same air day after day, unable to mark the passage of time, except by the clank of chains and the cough of a neighbor. You smelled the sour sweat, the mold that crept into every corner, the hopelessness that wore 1,000 faces. You saw old Tom, humming his lullaby to no one in particular, not because it helped, but because not singing was worse. You met the silence of forgotten justice, of laws to tangle to unravel, of guilt presumed and innocence ignored. You stood inside a floating world where no one was going anywhere, and even dreams had to fight to survive. And there, even in that slow decay, flickered moments of tenderness, a shared crust of bread, a whispered joke, a half-remembered poem scraped into the wood with a spoon. It wasn't grand, it wasn't glorious, but it was human, and sometimes that was enough. Then you sailed with Mary Bryant, not as a hero of headlines, but as a mother who held her child through 8 months at sea, through heat and hunger, through the brittle cold of a prison colony, where the soil itself seemed to resist forgiveness. You didn't see her as a myth. You saw her on her worst day, and her best. Her escape wasn't triumph, it was breath. Salt water carrying her just far enough until the wind changed again. And when it all came undone, when the Dutch guards recognized her face, when William died, when the baby didn't wake, there was no music, only the sound of chains, again. But something had changed. In her quiet, in her refusal to disappear entirely, she became not just a prisoner of the empire, but a truth it couldn't erase. And when she walked back through the streets of London, pardoned by a society that had once marked her as discardable, it wasn't a parade, it was a ghost returning, a woman stepping back into the fog, uncelebrated, but no longer invisible. Farther north you stood on the cracking ice with the crew of the Franklin expedition, not as explorers boldly striding across maps, but as men who slowly came to understand that the world they'd been trained to control had no interest in their rules. You heard the wind, not dramatic, but constant, like breath itself turning to frost. You touched the tins they'd opened, the bones they left behind, the notes scrawled in increasingly shaky hands. You listened to the Inuit stories, oral histories passed, with care, offering pieces of a puzzle no one had asked them to solve until it was too late. You understood that discovery is often just another word for unprepared arrival. And when you imagined the final moment, not a dramatic collapse, not a cinematic farewell, but the slow sinking of a man's knees into snow, you didn't recoil. You breathed in, you honored it, you let it be slow, and still, and honest. And then in the final chamber of this journey you joined the Royal Society, not to marvel at the sparks, or the glass, or the frogs that danced under strange electricity, but to sit quietly in the second row and notice what wasn't said, the servant memorizing Latin names without ever being invited to pronounce them aloud, the woman whose observations formed the basis of a footnote in her husband's paper, the scholar from India who spoke gently, clearly, and was politely unremembered. You watched the snuff boxes passed, the nods exchanged, the theories lifted like goblets to the light carefully, reverently, and yet, you also saw the shadows cast by that light, the edges where curiosity ended and comfort began. You saw how truth was measured, but not always shared, how enlightenment, for all its glow, left some corners cold. Now, in this moment, wherever you are, whatever time marks your night, you sit surrounded by those echoes, not the loud ones, not the ones printed in textbooks or recited in ceremonies, but the quiet ones, the breath between punishments, the silence after a door closes, the step not taken, the letter not sent, the question not asked. These, too, are history, not in opposition to triumphs and treaties, but as their context, their cost, their foundation, and they are the stories that ask less to be understood than to be witnessed. Perhaps, by now, your body has softened into your resting place. Perhaps your breathing has slowed. Perhaps your thoughts have begun to dissolve, not from confusion, but from peace. There is no need, now, to remember every date, every name, every place. Let them drift. Let them move past you like boats on a tide you no longer need to steer. You have done what history always asks of us in its truest form, not to memorize, not to judge, but to dwell, to stay long enough for the silence to say something. There's comfort, too, in knowing that the world you return to, your bed, your room, your soft routines, is a world where chains are less common, where journeys are easier, where curiosity can exist without always being punished. It's not perfect, but it's different, and that difference is built, in part, by the lives you've now remembered. Not because they were exceptional, but because they weren't, because they were ordinary people, caught in the gears of vast, indifferent systems, and they made choices, to hum, to steal a boat, to write, to die standing, to watch, to wait. The night is long, but so is memory, and as you drift now into sleep, or into stillness, you carry a trace of them with you, not like a burden, more like a thread, a connection, a rhythm, the kind that reminds you that even in the quietest rooms, even in the loneliest stories, there is breath, and breath, even forgotten, is never wasted. So, let go now. Let the stories slip back into silence. Let the ship settle into the silt. Let the ink dry. Let the candle sputter out. The world will wait. The names will wait. The sea is calm tonight. The cells are empty. The snow is undisturbed. And the chamber has grown quiet. Good night. Now, in this moment, wherever you are, whatever time marks your night, you sit, surrounded by those echoes. Not the loud ones, not the ones printed in textbooks or recited in ceremonies, but the quiet ones, the breath between punishments, the silence after a door closes, the step not taken, the letter not sent, the question not asked. These, too, are history, not in opposition to triumphs and treaties, but as their context, their cost, their foundation. And they are the stories that ask less to be understood than to be witnessed. You remember now that deep below the deck, on a ship that was never meant to move, someone like old Tom still hums to himself in memory, his voice barely more than a whisper under the roar of memory's tide. The chains rattle gently, less from motion and more from habit. Above, the Thames moves slowly, indifferently, brushing the hull like fingers over old scars. Somewhere in the dark, a cup rolls quietly on the boards, unsettled, not by footsteps, but by the shifting of rot. The smell of salt and sweat lingers in the air, fainter now. Like a ghost of something once sharp, it simply exists, woven into the breath of history. And Tom, perhaps he still hums, not because he believes someone hears him, but because it was the last thing he could claim. A lullaby not meant to soothe others, but to remind himself that he was still human. And then Mary, you see her again, walking the London streets, not with defiance, but with a softness carved from hardship, her shoes pressed down upon stones she once thought she'd never see again. The air smells the same, though now it tastes like distance. Her dress is plain, her face lined in places no portrait would bother to preserve. She doesn't look back, not because she's proud, but because she knows there is nothing left behind her that hasn't already been taken. And still, she moves forward. She passes a baker's stall and glances not with hunger, but with a kind of recollection, a hunger once known too well. And somewhere between the carriages and the chimney smoke, someone turns, thinking they've seen a ghost, and in a way, they have. A woman who lived through the edge of the world and returned not to applause, but to fog, to the same system that once erased her. And yet, she remains quietly, unmistakably. And farther still, where cold makes memory brittle, you return to the place where the Franklin men sleep beneath ice. Imagine, if you will, a torn scrap of paper left in the folds of a coat, pressed close to a ribcage long since still. On it, perhaps, a line unfinished, uncertain. If we do not, followed by a smear, a pause, a silence that never ended. The snow folds over them like a lullaby, endless and white. The dogs are gone. The fire's long, cold. But the story remains, frozen in place, not for spectacle, but for reverence, and in the minds of those who listen closely to the wind. There might still be an echo of a footstep in snow, of a voice calling softly for help, of the last shared biscuit passed from hand to shaking hand. No monument marks them, but the ice holds their names more gently than any marble could. And then there is the room, the one with polished floors and candlelight where the Royal Society gathered. You find yourself there now, seated in the quiet second row. The room is warm with ideas and colder with omission. You hear the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain as tea is stirred just once. Never twice etiquette demands restraint. A servant enters, careful not to interrupt, placing a tray on a velvet-draped table and backing away. He knows the language of the lectures better than some who speak them, but his silence is expected. The man in the corner adjusts his gloves. He never removes them, not even when he eats. They are a barrier, a boundary, a belief. The woman behind the curtain takes notes. Her observations are precise, her conclusions groundbreaking, but when her husband presents the paper next week, her name will be a footnote if it appears at all. You smell pipe smoke, a touch of must, the wax from the wall sconces softening with the hour, and as the lecturer gestures toward a glass frog suspended in saline, the real study happens behind him unseen. All these moments not lost, but rarely looked for settle now within you, not like burdens, but like feathers, quiet reminders, threads of breath, echoes of choices made not on grand stages, but in quiet spaces. A lullaby hummed, a gaze toward the stars, a name forgotten but once spoken softly. These are not stories with climaxes, they are not endings, they are presents, and presence is enough. So now, let yourself drift. The weight of blankets, the hush behind your eyelids, the rhythm of your breath, steady and soft. Let Tom's song blend into the creak of old wood. Let Mary's steps fade into the evening fog. Let the Franklin snow hold you still. Let the chamber grow quiet once more. History doesn't ask you to hold it tightly, just to rest alongside it, to let it remind you that even in the smallest rooms, in the faintest lives, meaning thrived. And tonight, it has kept you company. Now, in this moment, wherever you are, whatever time marks your night, you sit, surrounded by those echoes. Not the loud ones, not the ones printed in textbooks or recited in ceremonies, but the quiet ones, the breath between punishments, the silence after a door closes, the step not taken, the letter not sent, the question not asked. These, too, are history, not in opposition to triumphs and treaties, but as their context, their cost, their foundation. This, too, was history, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that waits. You remember now that deep below the deck, on a ship that was never meant to move, someone like old Tom still hums to himself in memory, his voice barely more than a whisper under the roar of memory's tide. The chains rattle gently, less from motion and more from habit. Above, the Thames moves slowly, indifferently, brushing the hull like fingers over old scars. Somewhere in the dark, a cup rolls quietly on the boards, unsettled not by footsteps but by the shifting of rot. The smell of salt and sweat lingers in the air fainter now, like a ghost of something once sharp. It no longer stings, it simply exists, woven into the breath of history. And Tom, perhaps he still hums, not because he believes someone hears him, but because it was the last thing he could claim. A lullaby not meant to soothe others, but to remind himself that he was still human. This, too, was history, not in court records or royal proclamations, but in the quiet endurance of one man's hum. And then Mary, you see her again, walking the London streets, not with defiance, but with a softness carved from hardship, her shoes pressed down upon stones she once thought she'd never see again. The air smells the same, though now it tastes like distance. Her dress is plain, her face lined in places no portrait would bother to preserve. She doesn't look back not because she's proud, but because she knows there is nothing left behind her that hasn't already been taken. Still, she moves forward. She passes a baker's stall and glances not with hunger, but with a kind of recollection, a hunger once known too well. And somewhere between the carriages and the chimney smoke, someone turns, thinking they've seen a ghost. And in a way, they have. A woman who lived through the edge of the world and returned not to applause, but to fog, to the same system that once erased her. And yet, she remains quietly, unmistakably alive. This, too, was history, not a name carved in stone, but a breath drawn, a street walked, a life continued. Farther still, where cold makes memory brittle, you return to the place where the Franklin men sleep beneath ice. Imagine, if you will, a torn scrap of paper left in the folds of a coat, pressed close to a ribcage long since still. On it, perhaps a line unfinished, uncertain, if we do not, followed by a smear, a pause, a silence that never ended. The snow folds over them like a lullaby, endless and white. The dogs are gone. The fire's long, cold, but the story remains, frozen in place, not for spectacle, but for reverence, and in the minds of those who listen closely to the wind. There might still be an echo of a footstep in snow, of a voice calling softly for help, of the last shared biscuit passed from hand to shaking hand. No monument marks them, but the ice holds their names more gently than any marble could. This, too, was history, not in the expedition's goal, but in the slowness of its unraveling. You may not remember the details, but perhaps you'll remember how it felt. And then, there is the room, the one with polished floors and candlelight where the Royal Society gathered. You find yourself there now, seated in the quiet second row. The room is warm with ideas, and colder with a mission. You hear the soft clink of a spoon against porcelain as tea is stirred just once. Never twice. Etiquette demands restraint. A servant enters, careful not to interrupt, placing a tray on a velvet-draped table, and backing away, eyes lowered. He knows the language of the lectures better than some who speak them, but his silence is expected. The man in the corner adjusts his gloves. He never removes them, not even when he eats. They are a barrier, a boundary, a belief. The woman behind the curtain takes notes. Her observations are precise, her conclusions groundbreaking. But when her husband presents the paper next week, her name will be a footnote if it appears at all. You smell pipe smoke, a touch of muss, the wax from the wall sconces softening with the hour, and as the lecturer gestures toward a glass frog suspended in the real study happens behind him unseen, unsaid, unfinished. This, too, was history, not the kind that advances in thunder, but the kind that exhales slowly in empty rooms. All these moments, not lost, but rarely looked for, settle now within you, not like burdens, but like feathers, quiet reminders. Threads of breath, echoes of choices made not on grand stages, but in quiet spaces. A lullaby hummed, a ship stolen, a gaze toward the stars, a name forgotten but once spoken softly. These are not stories with climaxes, they are not endings. They are presence, and presence is enough. You may not remember the details, but perhaps you'll remember how it felt. So now, let yourself drift. The weight of blanket, the hush behind your eyelids, the rhythm of your breath, steady and soft. Let Tom's song blend into the creak of old wood. Let Mary's steps fade into the evening fog. Let the Franklin snow hold you still, unhurried. Let the chamber grow quiet once more. History doesn't ask you to hold it tightly, just to rest alongside it, to let it remind you that even in the smallest rooms, in the faintest lives, meaning thrived. And tonight, it has kept you company. So now, rest. Feel the weight of the blanket, the hush behind your eyes, the warmth that holds you, even as the world fades. Notice the stillness around you, not silence, but a kind of quiet that listens. The soft thud of your heartbeat beneath the covers, the air, cooler now, gently brushing the curve of your cheek, the pillow that rises and falls in time with your breath, like a small boat rocking in calm water. You don't have to remember every place we went tonight, not the names, not the dates, not the endings. You don't have to hold those stories. Let them hold you. Let them settle around you like dusk, slow, natural, without need or weight. Let old Tom's lullaby become your lullaby. Let Mary's footsteps be the rhythm in your breath. Let the frost of the Arctic soothe your thoughts, not chill them. Let the candles in the Royal Society's hall flicker one last time, just enough to light your way inward. You are here, and that is enough. No judgment, no hurry, no test at the end. Only rest, only rhythm, only breath. History will wait. The stories will wait. The world will wait. You may drift now or not. You may sleep now, or simply lie still. There is no right way to end this night, only this moment, and the softness within it. Close your eyes, if they haven't closed already. Let your breath deepen, if it wishes. Let your thoughts grow heavy, like snow settling on quiet streets. And if you dream, may it be gentle. May it carry a whisper from the past, not to trouble you, but to remind you that even the quietest lives left echoes, that even you, in your quietest hour, are part of the story. Somewhere, deep beneath the slow-moving waters of the Thames, buried under silt and forgetful, an old hulk ship still rests, its timbers swollen with time, its chains no longer binding but rusted into silence. No flags wave above it, no guards walk the planks, but it is there, beneath the noise of buses and footsteps and city lights. Beneath steel bridges and hurried lives, the forgotten shell of punishment waits quietly, as it always has, and within it, If you listen not with ears but with memory, you might still hear the echo of old Tom's lullaby, unfinished, the way he always hummed it before sleep. You might feel the breath of those who lay shoulder to shoulder on Harmach's long-vanished breaths that were small rebellions, persistent in their refusal to disappear. The waves slapped the hull gently now, not in rage or urgency, but like a slow, maternal rocking saying, this, too, was real. This, too, mattered. This, too, remains. Not far from those same waters, Mary Bryant once walked again, older, quieter, pardoned, but not truly free. The same cobblestones where she had once been dragged in chains now lay beneath her feet, unchanged. But she had changed. Her story had moved across oceans and storms, over reefs, and between the narrow lines of law and mercy. And now, invisible to the crowd, she moved like a shadow of her own endurance, passing shop fronts, without recognition, passing memories she had no time left to unpack. A mother still. A survivor still. No statue, just breathing cold air, misting for a moment, then gone. But you were with her. You remembered her. You held her story softly, the way no courtroom ever could. And far to the north, where the ice meets the stars and time seems to freeze in both rhythm and reality, the men of the Franklin expedition are still there, frozen, not in flesh now, but in legend. There is a page, crumpled and wet, tucked inside a tin that no one ever found. Its words smear softly, but they might say something like, still hoping, still together, still trying to find light. They died without fanfare, but not without dignity. And even in the cold, even in the dark, there was the trace of human presence. A hand resting on a sled, a scarf tucked carefully under a frozen chin, a name carved into wooden letters so small they were meant more for the soul than for discovery. And tonight, you've followed them not for answers, but to witness, not to explain, but to feel. And in doing so, you offered them the one thing they never received in life, the warmth of company. And in the chambers of polished mahogany and smoky air, within the Royal Society where ideas rose like steam from teacups and vanished just as quickly, you heard more than lectures. You heard the small rustle of notes not cited, voices never published, questions never answered, the servant who handled mercury with bare hands, but was never allowed to ask why it shimmered so strangely, the woman who passed a hypothesis folded into her husband's waistcoat pocket only for it to be recited later, without her name, the scholar from Bengal who spoke 7 languages, but whose accent was quietly smiled at and then forgotten. In those rooms of reason, you saw the limits of reason, and yet, they still gathered, they still asked, they still believed that to name the world was to know it, even if they missed the names that mattered most. And even now you can still smell the pipe smoke that clung to the curtains, still hear the tick of the long case clock as a theory failed to land, still feel the weight of an unsaid thought waiting behind a closed mouth. This, too, is history, not the kind carved into the arches of triumph, not the kind embroidered onto banners or quoted in debates, but the kind that waits quietly, the kind that sits beside you in the dark, not asking to be remembered exactly, but to be felt, to be honored in the stillness it left behind. And you may not carry every date, every name, every page, but perhaps you'll remember how it felt, the hush of the decks, the scrape of a spoon on tin, the creak of a sled over ice, the rustle of a forgotten note in a velvet pocket, the breath between punishments, the candle before it gutters out. And now, you are part of that silence, not because you suffered it, but because you chose to sit with it. You didn't turn away, you didn't ask it to entertain, you let it speak in its own slow language. And in doing so, you gave it rest. So now, rest yourself. Feel the weight of the blankets pressing you gently downward. Feel the hush behind your eyes. Feel the warmth that wraps around your ribs like an old coat. There is nothing you need to do now. No ships to board. No names to remember. No theories to prove. Just this breath. And the next. And the next. You don't need to hold the stories. Let them hold you. Let them cradle you. Not like burdens, but like lullabies. Quiet songs hummed by voices long gone, voices that once waited in the dark, and are now, finally, at peace. Somewhere, deep beneath the Thames, the ship does not creak anymore. It listens, it rests, it remembers, and above it, the city moves on forgetting. But you have not forgotten, and because of that, neither have they. Sleep now, the past is quiet again.